When you play the Game of Thrones, you
Subscribe and like.
or you die. There is no middle ground.
Alright, welcome back to the Grease Comms YouTube channel. Today's video, we're going to be talking about number 91 on my Best of Song of Ice and Fire characters list, and today's will be Rickard Stark, the father of Ned, Benjen, Brandon, and Lyanna Stark. Now, this character to me is a very weird one, because he doesn't have, I guess, the most to discuss about as a character in terms of, like, lore or previous stuff before the story starts. But he's such an influential character that he has to be on here because I think what he does is so interesting, because a lot of the Starks in the North are Starks that very much do not interact with the South. They kind of, marry into other northern houses, keep very much of their influence and their watch on the wall and things like that. Rickard Stark is very different in that way, and so that's where a lot of our main discussion is going to be, as this character is very central to why Robert's Rebellion kind of happens in the way it does, because he's central in creating a lot of the alliances and some of the things going on in the North interacting with the South, something that's almost unheard of that only happens every once in a while. If you think about, like, for instance, Cregan Stark and his role in the dance, or I guess the ending of the dance more than the actual, like, war itself. But yeah, so we're going to talk about him in today's video. And so let's talk about Rickard Stark. Rickard Stark was born at Winterfell, the only child of Lord Edwyl Stark and Lady Marna Locke. Rickard would, again, we don't know a ton about his early life up until when he becomes basically a father. And we also don't really know when he was born. The estimated ages would be anywhere from like 230 to 250 AC. So again, a very big gap. If you think about this, for instance, like Brandon Stark is born in 262 AC. So I would say, given how early it seems like a lot of Starks marry and have children, I would say I would lean more towards anywhere from 240 AC to around 250 AC. Just based upon the fact that if you go further than that, he's into his 20s, and you're like, why did it take so long for him to marry? Be very interesting. But Rickard marries his cousin once removed, Lyanna Stark. Now, we know basically nothing about Lyanna Stark. If you look up this character, all we truly know about, Lyanna Stark is that she was Ned's mother. That's it. I mean, outside of that, we don't know anything else. We know that she had to have at least, lived until at least 267 AC or later, whenever Benjen was born. We're not exactly sure when he was born. It just would have to be after Lyanna, and the latest that Lyanna was born was 267 AC. So we know that at least Lyanna Stark would have at least lived until Ned was at least 4 or 5. We just don't know anything really about her, and so there's not much to really speculate on. Again, the things that get very interesting about the character of Rickard Stark is from a very early age, he is someone that has a lot of dealings with the South. For instance, Lord Rickard goes to King's Landing in 264 AC, only about a year after Ned was born, and he actually has talks with Aerys Targaryen, who is still very new. And when I talked about Aerys Targaryen, one of the things that I did in my Robert's Rebellion videos, I painted who he was as a person that led him to become mad. And one of those things is Aerys was somebody that he had big plans and big dreams, but he never really executed those things. They just kind of stayed as plans, more or less. And so one of those things that Lord Rickard seems to have put to the table with Aerys Targaryen was building another wall and claiming more land in the far north. And that makes more sense, right? Secure your borders in the north, gain more land that would be able to be under the crown for Aerys and even the Starks. Makes a lot of sense, but never really happens. And even Lady Olenna, again, Olenna Tyrell, at this time, she would have been Olenna Redwine. She was actually loosely acquainted with Rickard. So you see that, from an early age, right? Rickard, even if you want to go back and say that he was born in 230, and so this would mark him being about 34 years of age, he actually had a lot of dealings with the South. He's somebody that got acquainted with somebody as influential as Olenna, Redwine, or Olenna Tyrell eventually, which I think is very interesting. And again, we don't know a ton about Rickard Stark in terms of his personality and things like that, but one thing we do know that Lord Rickard at least was enough of a presence and a dominating force in the politics of the North that Lord Roose Bolton had to actually cut the tongue from a miller's brother who had seen him kill and rape a miller's wife. So yeah, Roose Bolton was someone that was still undermining the Starks, but he knew that he couldn't let that get out to Rickard Stark because of what Rickard Stark might do. And so it kind of shows you that Rickard Stark was not like somebody like a Tytos Lannister where he was a pushover and all those things. He's very proactive, and I think one thing that maybe we could see from Rickard Stark is he focused more on southern ambitions than the actual infrastructure and the actual running of the North. You might be able to, see that from how the Night's Watch was declining, how Roose Bolton was undermining him. Even though Rickard Stark wouldn't be able to know those things, it was still something that was happening. And so during this time period, you have a lot of things that creep up right away. And Rickard Stark to me is very interesting because, I've put forth this idea of what was Rickard Stark planning to do? Was he trying to build like a defensive alliance against the South? Did he foresee some conflict with the South? Was it just him trying to gain power, create relationships with the people of the South? Because again, early on, we see that Rickard negotiates the betrothal of his heir, Brandon Stark, to Catelyn Tully of Riverrun. And even after that point, also, it seems like that Rickard was trying to betroth Lyanna to Robert Baratheon, as Ned had basically been kind of the broker of this as he carried Robert's proposal to Winterfell. And so you come to this idea and you're like, okay, well, the Starks are marrying into the Baratheons, marrying into the Tullys. Well, who is Ned going to marry? Because we have no real indication of who Ned was going to marry until after Brandon dies and after Rickard dies. So what was maybe Rickard planning for who Ned was going to be betrothed to, or who, for instance, Benjen was going to be married to? There was a lot of questions that would have been asked at this time of kind of the future of some of these others, because Ned is somebody that is older than Lyanna by a few years, and yet Ned was somebody that didn't really have a partner. Now, you can go with the idea that Ashara Dane was somebody that maybe Ned was looking to marry with his father's approval. You can go off of kind of Order of the Green Hands theory on that idea. I don't subscribe to that theory, but that is a definite possibility that maybe, Ned was be able to be free to pick kind of his own partner, and as long as his father approved of it, then it was okay. Ned being kind of the second son, it's not your main priority if you're someone like Rickard Stark. They are used more to broker alliances, and maybe he was keeping his options open, given maybe a conflict that he could have seen brewing. Maybe he was just leaving his options open with, marrying Ned to somebody else or betrothing Benjen to somebody else in the future. Maybe he was just keeping his options open and not locking everything up, but at least giving a lot of his assets, to the Baratheons and the Tullys, functioning basically a alliance at this time. Something that also could have been very interesting if you think about during kind of this time period and you have Cersei Lannister trying to be married to Rhaegar. That was Tywin's plan. It would have been interesting if Cersei, she stays, single, more or less, not betrothed to anybody. If Ned had not had to take up Brandon's betrothal to Catelyn, would Tywin have tried to forge an alliance with the Starks, right? Using Cersei as that piece to broker an alliance with the Starks. That could have been possible at this time. We know that, Tywin was, trying to get, for instance, Jaime and also Cersei married, but he was kind of saving Cersei for the throne. And so maybe Tywin wouldn't have done that kind of a deal, but it is interesting to kind of think about because there's a lot of things going on at this time. And one of the things we do know about a lot of this southern ambition that was going on during the time was Barbary Dustin. She was somebody that tells us in the main story in A Dance with Dragons that she believed that the proposed marriages were the idea of Rickard's maester at the time, Wallace Flowers, who, again, had a mother that was an unknown Hightower, a very southern influence, right? Wallace could have been telling him, yeah, it's a good thing to make alliances with other, houses in the South, to look outside of just the North, because, again, it seems to be that Barbary Dustin and Brandon Stark had a relationship. Could have made sense for those two to have been married, again, a northern relationship. But because of somebody like Wallace, who she believes screwed everything up, this led to southern ambitions kind of popping up. And so you kind of come to this point of 282 AC where you have Rickard Stark going south for the marriage of Brandon and Catelyn. But we know this doesn't go completely correct. And I'm not going to go down into basically all the Robert's Rebellion stuff that happens, but just the things that kind of apply to Rickard. But Rickard comes south, and right away he has a massive issue on his plate. One issue is right away that Lyanna seems to be missing, and it allegedly has been captured by Rhaegar. The other part of it is that you have this other issue where Brandon Stark goes to the capital and gets himself arrested. And so if you're Rickard Stark, what do, right? Brandon Stark is your heir. You need to go to the throne to get him released and try to work something out. And the other part of it that's really massive is that Brandon Stark is kind of the key to a lot of the Southern ambitions that, Rickard Stark had. And so Rickard Stark, goes to the capital to try and free him. And Rickard Stark, being kind of how the Starks are, right? Trying to get justice by, the gods and things like that, he demands a trial by combat. And for any normal person, you might have been thinking, if you're Rickard Stark, right? A trial by combat is still not a very good option. If you think about some of the people that were in the Kingsguard at that time, one of the most famous Kingsguard ever was Aerys II's. It's not a great likelihood that he may have been able to actually beat one of them. Now, who could he have beaten? I don't know. And does this show that Rickard Stark was somebody that had a ton of skill? You'd have to assume so. If he was willing to do a trial by combat going against one of the Kingsguard, you had to assume he was pretty skilled, because if I am someone like Aerys and he demands a trial by combat and I'm thinking rationally, well, I'm just like, okay, I'm going to throw Barristan Selmy out there, or I'm going to throw Geralt Hightower out there. I'm going to throw maybe Jaime Lannister out there. Honestly, Jaime Lannister is probably not a bad one to even throw out there, because if Jaime Lannister was to lose the trial by combat, not only does Aerys take Tywin's heir and make it basically he's invalid, he also gets him killed. So there's an interesting issue here, because you also then have Arthur Dayne as well, who could have been here. You have some of the best swordsmen of all time in this Kingsguard. And so Rickard, maybe it was a play of desperation, there was no other way. How do you get Brandon out of his crimes when Brandon, straight up says, I'm trying to kill Rhaegar and threatening the prince? It's not a good look. Maybe Rickard could have asked for Brandon to be sent to the wall, but that screws up all of his plans, right? And so Rickard basically tries in my opinion, a Hail Mary, right? But unfortunately for him, he does not get to even attempt it, because what actually ends up happening is he, dressed in all of his steel armor, he was brought to the throne room, where Aerys II declared that fire was the champion of House Targaryen. Rickard was suspended from the rafters, and a fire was lit beneath him by the pyromancers. Rickard was slowly cooked to death in his armor, while his son Brandon, with a Tyroshi noose around his neck and a sword just out of his reach, was made to watch his father roast. Trying to reach the sword to save his dying father, Brandon strangled himself. And all the other, people basically that were there, nobles and sons alike, were executed by Aerys, with the exception of Ethan Glover. And Rickard would leave behind a massive issue in his wake, and his southern alliances that he had been forming creates this defensive pact. This really feels like, if you want to compare it to normal history, that World War I moment, right? You have the death of somebody that impacts a bunch of different countries, and that gets the ball going, because you have a bunch of defensive alliances and all these things with others, so it splits the country. So one little thing can lead to a massive world war. And that's what occurs here, right? Because Rickard Stark and Brandon Stark are killed, well, Ned Stark's going to fill in Brandon Stark's relationships, so the Tullys are pulled into the war. The Vale, Rickard Stark had sent Ned to basically be fostered with the Arryns. So Jon Arryn had basically become a father figure for Ned and also Robert. And so that had brought them kind of into the offensive alliance as well. If you even think about Lyanna, it seems like she was somebody that was also spending a lot of time around the Harrenhal area with maybe somebody like Lady Went and, all that stuff going on at the time. You see this defensive alliance pop up. Because of this happening, and because of what Aerys does next, where he calls for the heads of Robert and Ned, it leads to a conflict that gets the entire country involved in having to pick a side between Robert, the rebellion side, and Aerys and the loyalist side. And so Rickard Stark, in and of himself, is a character we don't actually know a ton about in terms of his personality, some of his actions, what drove those actions. He's a character that is one of the most important and vital to the story, and so I felt that he needed to be on this list because of his importance, that this story does not function even a little bit without him, and some of the things that he placed and how kind of motivated he was by his southern ambitions, and that led to kind of the death of a lot of the people in his family. But let me know what you guys think about Rickard Stark. Do you think he was doing the right thing, trying to gain power and trying to make alliances with some of the southern houses to make a more defensible situation if any of them were attacked by the Targaryens or anything like that? They had kind of a set-up plan to go. I don't know. I think, to me, Rickard Stark is a very fascinating character. Is this the Maester conspiracy that's playing in here, or is it just somebody's ambition? But let me know what you guys all think, and I'll see you guys all in the next one. Bye, guys.